Well, today we're going to examine just how necessary it is to understand the textual elements that surround the interpretation of any text. A text does not just stand on its own, but it occurs within these larger spheres by which we can discover the meaning by which the author intended with the writing. So we're going to look at the Samaritan Parable, the famous story. Is anyone not familiar with the Samaritan Parable, the Good Samaritan?
I know the one.
Okay, we got one. It's pretty well known. Yeah, the guy gets robbed and he's laying in the ditch, and along comes one guy, a priest, come by, a Levite. They don't help, but then along comes this Samaritan, and he helps this Judean who's wounded. So that's the story. Now, we need to look at the context to find out just what it is that Jesus is being asked and what question he is giving the answer to help us understand the answer. So, the problem is, though, that many people do not know the larger contexts. And so we're going to examine the various different ones. This will include such things as the larger cultural, literary corpus that they read, the books that they read, the themes that they're familiar with in their culture at large. And then when we examine the actual book of Luke, we have to realize that's part of the 2-volume work, Luke Acts. So we're actually looking at the man Luke who wrote the 2-volume work, Luke Acts. So we'll look at the preceding context before the parable to see how Luke prepares for us to understand the parable. Then we'll look at certain things within the parable itself that give intertext, that are allusions to the Old Testament, that are allusions to these books that everybody is reading. So they will recognize what is being said and then connect it to the meanings that are in that intertext, the intertextual allusions. Then we'll see how Luke follows this up with the succeeding text in Luke and Acts, and by that increasing and narrowing and then expanding spheres of contextual relations, we will be able to understand that the Messianic Reunification is the theme. Now, we're going to define Messianic Reunification for you here, but that is that when the Messiah comes, it's all over the prophets, the major prophets, the minor prophets. This book of Chronicles has a very positive view towards the future. Reuniting of the divided kingdom. If you're not familiar, the kingdom of David was split shortly after his death. And his son Solomon ruled the United Kingdom, but when he died, it was split. And so you've had this long-running relationship of increasing discord between northern and southern Israel. They're even fighting. We're going to examine later where they're fighting one another. And that, in fact, is very important to understanding the parable itself. So we'll say, here's one of them. The book of Jeremiah is a very famous one, and it talks about the new covenant with the house of Israel and the house of Judah. And then the major prophet Isaiah also addresses how this Messiah will come, the shoot from the spring of Jesse. Jesse was the father of David, and the son of David is the Messiah. So it's a long, you have to know quite a bit, but it's something about the king who will come, and he will take away the enmity between the two kingdoms and reunite them again in loving amity. So then the major prophet Ezekiel even addresses this, and we're just examining, just looking at these three, but it clearly talks here. But Ephraim is the northern kingdom of Israel, and so the northern and the southern kingdoms will be reunited again, and they will have, at the bottom you see, wrong button. Okay, well, okay, I'm going to have to do this manually because I'm not sure about the technology. So we see down here at the bottom that there will be one king will be king for all of them. And they will no longer be two nations and no longer be divided into two kingdoms. You can't get much clearer than that. So these were the books that everybody in the first century to which Luke addressed this parable understood. They understood this theme. It's very prominent in many other places in the Old Testament as well. So now we move away from this larger cultural, literary context to the specific context of Luke Acts. And in the preceding narrative context, before we get to the actual parable, you see in large there's a theological theme in Acts that focuses on the Davidic king. So the Jesus is the Messiah, who is the son of David, the ancestor that is the king that is to come. And so David had the united kingdom. When the son of David comes, he's going to reunite the kingdom. This is, you see Strauss and Zwiep and Hahn, who are just three scholars who address this. Several scholars recognize that Luke Acts does present the Samaritans as Israelites. This is a contested position, and yet I feel it's very strong. We see it all the way, from early days up through very late scholarship. And so I have a messed up slide here, but what I'm trying to say is that now we're looking at the narrative preceding co-text, and so you look at the beginning of the Gospel of Luke. The Samaritan Parable appears in chapter 10, and from the very beginning we have this focus on Jesus as the ancestor. His ancestor was David, and he's given this royal status. Jesus was self-aware of this. In fact, they kept close genealogical records. Jesus knew that his ancestors were a whole line of kings. And so the preceding narrative context. Oh, okay, now we see when we get to Luke, I wonder if I have more here. Yeah, I do, okay. In Luke 9:27, we have the beginning of some of this preceding co-text, where Jesus says that there are going to be some people there who are going to see the restoration of the kingdom. And then when we begin this long traveling from northern Israel down to Jerusalem, Jesus is just starting to pass through Samaria, which is an unusual act in itself. Many Judeans, pious Judeans, have totally avoided Samaria. They wouldn't go through it. But Jesus chose to take his people through Samaria, and in fact, we'll see that he ministered to Samaritans, which was very disapproved by some of the Judeans. So when he was traveling through, we see this ongoing effort to restore the amity between Judeans and Samaritans. We see in the Luke 9:51 that he was determined to go to Jerusalem. But what happened was the Samaritan, Luke is reminding us of this bitter hatred between the Judeans and the Samaritans. So here comes Jesus with his disciples. They're looking for some hospitality from fellow Israelites. They come to a Samaritan village, and they're rejected. They don't allow them to come in. And so, James and John are two of Jesus' big disciples who just react with this traditional hatred. And they say, "Lord, do you want us to command fire to come down from heaven and consume the village?" And Jesus said, he rebuked them. A very strong, negative, disapproving act. And so they went on to another Samaritan village where they did accept them. So Luke is showing both that there is this long-going warfare, but also that Jesus is in the process of healing these divisions. And so then we get to Jesus sends out 70 disciples to go minister to the Samaritan villages. And he tells them to practice table fellowship. Now, in the Davidic covenant, even, this is part of the long Old Testament background, but eating and fellowshipping with a person is a sign of accepting them and of being in covenant together. So the fact that these Judeans are told to practice table fellowship with Samaritans is another sign that Jesus is saying, these are your fellow Israelites, don't hate them anymore, but come to love them. Now, that's the quote there. Oh, okay, so then when they come back, he tells, the message there to give when they are ministering to the Samaritans is that the kingdom of God has come near you. So there, we're always back to Jesus talking about the kingdom. And so right before the parable, the verse right before the pericope, the section that contains the parable, there's a statement that Jesus concludes all of this ministry in Samaria. And he says that the prophets and kings okay, here's the actual quote. Blessed are the eyes which see the things you see. For I say to you that many prophets and kings wish to see the things that you see. This is the only place anywhere in the Gospels where it talks about, kings. So then we get to the actual question, and we see that it seems to anticipate how the Judean can participate in the Messianic age to come. And so that lets us see that the second question to which Jesus is responding with the parable is that the Judean is considered the Samaritan as fellow Israelite. So we see the intertextual allusions here, the two big ones. The second big one is recognized by many scholars. This story in which Jesus gives a update in his parable is about Judeans who were captured by the Samaritans in their war, and they treated them accordingly. Their religious motivation. They did loyal assistance to the fellow Israelites, clothing them, carrying them on a donkey, taken to Jericho. Jesus gives this same story in an updated version, showing the cessation of war between the two kingdoms and the restoration of love based on the common divine worship. So we see this followed up right after the parable. Jesus prays. He tells the disciples to pray, "Your kingdom come." Jesus is against division. He says, "Any kingdom divided against itself falls." When he prepares to ascend, he says they will be empowered by the Holy Spirit. Now we see what happens is the fulfillment coming up in the book of Acts. The Spirit does come on the Judeans, and then some Judeans go up to the Samaritans, and the Spirit comes on them. This is the fulfillment of the reunification of the kingdom, with Jesus sitting on the heavenly throne. Now this is before the Gentiles are ever reached. So the conclusion is that by examining the cultural literary context, the books that they read, the preceding narrative context that was before the parable, the intertextual allusions within the parable, and the succeeding context, and the fulfillment of the Messianic prophetic theme, all indicate Jesus is answering the question, whom must the Judean accept as a fellow Israelite in order to participate in the Messianic restoration of the reunited kingdom of Israel? And it is that question that Jesus is answering when we have a look at the parable. That's next time. Thank you.
Thank you.